Cloud Foundry, Chip Childers, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm not an entrepreneur.
Yes, you
No, I'm not. I'm not. So, you might ask, why on earth are you here to talk about entrepreneurial things? I've been in the technology industry for about 20 years, I think, ish. Actually, it's 2019 now. Okay, 21 years. And I work with a lot of really large companies today. Fortune 500, Global 2000. I have the opportunity to spend a lot of time with CIOs, vice presidents of business development, a number of people that in these really large companies are scared to death of startups. So today, what I actually wanted to do was to use some of my career, my history, over these 20 years, to walk through a whole bunch of failures of large companies, right? And so how many of you in here are actively entrepreneurs that feel like you compete against a large company? Anybody? A couple? Yeah, I would think so, right? Okay. Well, for those of you that don't feel like you compete against a large company, well, maybe you can learn something, but for those of you that actually do feel like you compete against large companies, I want to tell you about their weak spots, right? And I'm going to attempt to use some history, right, my personal career. I do a lot of public speaking, generally to like 1,000 or more people, and it's always in keynote format, so this is a little bit intimate, right? So I'm going to use some note cards to make sure I can remember everything that I wanted to tell you about. So I work for this organization called the Cloud Foundry Foundation. Long and short of it is we're an industry association that supports an open source software platform that's commercialized by a bunch of the big technology companies. All right, cool. None of that has to do with why I actually get to experience conversations with big bank CIOs and why they're scared of the startup. It's because they're attempting to use software to actually gain a competitive advantage against all these startups that are running around kind of picking off pieces of their business. So the way that they're looking at the world, how many of you anybody want to take a guess at the average lifetime of a company in the S&P 500 back in about 1950, right? How long do you think those companies stuck around? Anybody have a guess?
30 years.
No, 30 years? Wow, this is 1950. Everybody stuck around a lot longer than that, right? So it was actually 60 years, so double that. Today, it's you were close, less than 20 today, right? That's a big shift. The Fortune 500 that existed in the year 2000, there are less than 45% of them that are still companies, right? So we've seen the rate of change, and some of your startup story is an example, right? Some of what you're doing is exactly what scares some of the incumbents that exist in the market, right? They're seeing so much churn and so much change happen in their markets that there's big shifts occurring. So, all right, so why are these companies disappearing? Well, it's bankruptcy. It could be that merger acquisition. They could just get a lot smaller. These are all kind of natural things. And there's really, I think there's 3 causes to this. So the first cause is, well, it's tech week, right? So technology, automation, that's been accelerating. This is just a trend that's fundamentally shifting consumer expectations. It's shifting the way that companies do business with each other. But more importantly, it also makes it a lot easier to start a new business, right? To go after somebody's particular, a niche of their market. It's so much easier. The second challenge that we have, and I'd love to keep this structured here, right? So the second one is because there's a new model for startups where there's an existing model for startups that works really well that's now growing and more companies are doing it, which is what's called disaggregating a value chain. That's a lot of polysyllabic words in there, right? So a value chain represents how as a consumer, how do I go about the process of getting something new, right? So if I want to go to a store, let's think back to pre-initial internet boom. I want to go get a new shirt. What do I need to do? Well, I have to go to the store. I have to go look at the racks. I then make a choice. I then pay for it. Now I have it, right? And you have to try it on. I don't actually do that. I know my size. I just kind of eye it up. My wife's here. She's like, yeah, he just buys. He doesn't shop. It's really weird. Yeah. So that was pre-e-commerce, right? So if you think about what was a fundamental change in the way that we interact with businesses. Most of the clothing that people are buying now is coming from an e-commerce purchase. And even more so, now there's the whole thing where you just subscribe and people just send you new clothes constantly, right? And you can kind of decide what you like and just put it back in the box, it disappears. So each one of those innovations or changes in the way that we acquire clothing is fundamentally looking at how the consumer interacts to get to that product, and it chops it off at a certain point, right? So it's a really powerful way that large companies are getting, frankly, they're losing huge market share. And then I think the third challenge, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular one because it's, I could probably talk for a couple hours about it, but there's a concept of a platform business and platform economics. There's a few professors that are up at MIT Sloan School of Business that have spent an enormous amount of time thinking about the concept of platform economics. And we hear about it like Facebook's a platform, Amazon's now a platform. Any of these companies that figures out how to interact with you as a consumer, but then begin to leverage it so that other businesses can exchange value in that environment, right? And this concept of platform economics is what gave rise to Apple, right? Through, frankly, the mobile phone, the iPhone. The Macintosh computer really doesn't do enough of a platform economics to have qualified there. Amazon, Google, right? All of the billion-dollar companies right now are, I'm sorry, what are we approaching? Trillion-dollar companies, that family. You can tell I've been paying attention to this for a while. So trillion-dollar companies now, all of them are platform-based. So that's what's really kicking the butt of all the large incumbents, right? There's a really good book that I recommend to anybody called The End of Competitive Advantage. It's by a lady named Rita Gunther McGrath. She's a professor up at Columbia in New York. And what Rita talks about is that, it used to be, back in the 1950s, when we were talking about who's got a competitive edge, you would say, well, anybody who is able to stake out a part of the market and then defend it long term, they're going to be able to survive for a while, right? And so all those reasons that I just gave means that fundamentally, and this is measured by these business professors, there's no such thing as a sustainable competitive advantage anymore. It's just not there. So what you have to do as an organization, and in particular a large organization, is they have to figure out how they're going to iterate and learn and behave a lot more like look at that. I didn't even have to figure out how to pour it. It's full serve here. So that's the problem that these large companies have right now, but that's your opportunity as an entrepreneur, in particular those of you that are competing with the large firms or large companies. So a lot of examples abound of a lot of this disruption. So I can name a bunch, but I like Kodak because I think there's two waves of disruption that Kodak could have gone through. I think they lost at the first wave. So Kodak, of course, was the film company, right? They still are. They really missed the boat for digital photography. All of you that just think about your cell phone now, right? That was the second wave. Because all of a sudden, we went from having separate digital cameras, like that one over there, to now all of us have our own digital video recording device. We can take pictures with the phones. So Kodak actually missed two complete cycles of product innovation. And where are they now, right? They still exist as a company, but they're now really just a niche product, and they focus on professional photographers. That's fundamentally changed, what we think about as what Kodak is. I remember growing up thinking they're an enormous company. So that was Kodak. They're a good example. All right. So I told you I was going to talk about career. I'm going to try to go through this rather quickly because there's a lot of interesting inflection points unwinding. I started asking about the 1950s, but let's fast forward again. Late 90s. Who here was working during the first internet boom? Bubble, bust. Okay, I was. All right. So the young folks in the room weren't working then, but it was a disaster. So here's the thing. That was late 90s. This is the first moment where we saw some of the major hype cycles that we're now seeing waves of happen in the market. And anybody here remember Pets.com? Okay, anybody here also have the puppet? Do you really?
I do. We lost about $500,000 because of them. Yeah.
Okay, so Yeah, I'm really upset because I got rid of that puppet back in like a while ago. I think before we got married. Oh, was it 2003? Look at that. All right. So anyway, so the initial internet boom and bust was fascinating. So actually, I was just thinking about Pets.com specifically because they're a great example. So here's the deal. Zero to IPO in less than a year. Pretty fast, right? 6 months later, they were out of business, bankrupt, shut down, right? Purely because of hype, right? That first cycle, and this happens in increasing waves in the technology space in particular, but I think we're starting to see the whole market go through this too. We have these mega hype waves that happen. And in the late 90s, it was an enormous amount of hubris. Those of us, like myself, that were working in downtown Philadelphia for interactive agencies, we weren't even in like hot startups. We were working for like pharmaceutical companies in a web agency, which is great work, but not a hot startup. And we were having these moments at the one bar, Lucy's Hat Shop, which was down in an old city. And every Friday night, we call this the Chimay Days, because we had so much hubris. We would go in there, we would sit down at about 5 o'clock on Friday, and we would leave when they said, look, we're out of the Chimay. All right, horrible idea for somebody in the early 20s, right? Save your money. Don't waste it on Chimay. So that was back in the late 90s, early 2000s, the thing crashed. But here's one of the most fundamental things that changed that I think we all know. Fundamentally, we expect a digital experience when interacting with businesses as consumers today, right? Like, there are very few businesses that I will accept that won't give me at least a reasonable website, if not, a much more interactive experience. That's very different. And now let's fast forward, a lot. We have a lot of different expectations than we used to. So there was a permanent change that happened in the economy back then. All right, so now I'm going to step forward and say that was a lot of hubris. Let's talk about my personal career and a large company that invented a new industry, made enormous amounts of money, and then, well, we'll get to the end result in a little bit. So I joined a company called SunGard. SunGard's a weird company. It was founded back in, let's see, when were they founded? Not when I was working there. It was founded back in '83. It was spun out of Sun Oil. And it was spun out as a very simple concept. Back in '83, everybody ran all their IT on a big mainframe, right? My phone has more power than those things did. Okay, but it was the key to most businesses. And Sun Oil's CIO was sitting there and he was going, well, what happens if we have a fire? We only have one of these things. So they looked around at the different banks that are downtown Philadelphia. Remember, like, there actually used to be banks headquartered in Philadelphia. So talked to all those banks in downtown Philadelphia and said, listen, you all have one mainframe too. What happens if yours catches on fire, right? So they invented an industry that became known as the disaster recovery industry. Super simple concept. They were going to buy one other mainframe computer and put it somewhere else. And then they were going to sell subscriptions to the possibility of using it. And then if you wanted to use it, they were going to charge you even more. It was amazing margin, amazing margin. And then they started doing that with a lot of different hardware, right? So the point they were trying to help with disaster planning and recovery for whole IT systems. There's this notion of workforce continuity. SunGard was responsible for backup sites for the stock exchanges and commodity exchanges, both in New York as well as in Chicago. This is back before electronic exchanges, where you had to actually be yelling at the specialist to yell your order. They needed a place to go if, for example, in 9/11, when the New York Stock Exchange wasn't there, that floor reopened at a SunGard facility because they needed to keep the economy going. So that was an amazing business. We also moved into the hosting business. Now, hosting is basically website hosting or hosting some physical servers. That's what it was. Now we don't do that. Does anybody remember that bookseller, Amazon? Yeah, no, nobody's never heard of them. All right, so SunGard had an interesting, profitable business. I'm going to knock this thing over. A profitable business, and then in 2000, some private equity firms agreed. In 2005, they were acquired. The largest leveraged buyout from private equity at the time that was technology-centric, about $11.5 billion for a buyout. Went private, cool, and then that bookseller launches this thing called Amazon Web Services. that was kind of interesting. We at the time were like, that's weird. What a toy. Yeah. So we thought that was a toy. So we didn't really believe in the disruptive potential of that thing. It was 2006 that they launched Amazon Web Services, which that was the first thing that we would call cloud computing. Everybody heard that term? Yeah. Now we just call it computers, right? Because like everything's acquired that way. We didn't recognize it. So fast forward even more, we've got these fancy private equity owners, Silver Lake, KKR, Texas Pacific, and so we're going to do an innovation initiative. Doesn't that sound like this is going to be a winner? Okay, so we get a whole bunch of people together, like senior engineers, senior product manager types, and we go into the headquarters building of our company, and we sit there for months at a time, having a commute from Center City, Philadelphia, down out to Wayne, and a bunch of us didn't have a car, and that was a real pain in the neck. But we did it anyway. Okay, so we did that, and then we go and present to the private equity folks, and they look at us and go, "There's 4 really great ideas. Why are you talking to us about this? Just start innovating, start doing something." So we spent an awful lot of time innovating, but producing no product. All right, so that didn't work out particularly well. So then we go, all right, well, let's actually build something. All right, now we're going to get some traction. So we did actually start to build a cloud-like service. It was I won't get into the details of it, but let's just say our customers liked it. However, it wasn't forward-looking enough. In less than 3 years, we managed to book about $100 million in revenue, which is contracts, actually, booked contracts over the 3-year window. That was great, but we had an existing sales force who didn't want to sell it. So this was like pushing a rock up a hill. Again, remember, those of you that are startups, you're like, I don't understand. Why is that a problem? You have salespeople that should just go sell the thing. If you've got a couple hundred, if you have one salesperson, they might not know how to sell the new thing, right? And that was a huge problem for this big company. They couldn't change the way that the sales force actually operated because this new thing, different, therefore harder. That's at least what they thought. It actually was easier. It was closer to what the customers wanted, but they didn't understand it. So we managed to build this thing that just was supposed to save SunGard. All right, and I kind of gave up and left. So we're going to pause on SunGard for a minute. I'm going to come back to them because they have some recent news. And I'll tell you about the one time I was at a startup, and it was also a massive failure. So most startups fail, right? And so I was at SunGard, I'm feeling kind of stuck, and I said, and I keep picking on her to my wife over there, and said, hey, I want to try a startup. But I don't want to do one. I want to join one that already exists. And there's like 4 people in it. It's been around for, I think at the time it was about 4 years. I think I can help them pivot and finally succeed, right? And that was probably the greatest learning experience I've had in my career. Was 1 year working for a startup that ran out of money 6 months into that 1 year, and had demonstrated to me a couple things that I'm going to recommend to any of you that are either doing startups or plan on doing one. All right, so number 1, cash is king, right? Because you can't pay people without cash. They ran out really fast after I joined. They had a bunch of really good investments early on. But here's the second thing that I learned. Pivoting is really essential. Everybody thinks about like, okay, I have to find that product market fit. I need to be able to be really flexible and pivot as I go. But what they were doing, they probably had 5 or 6 pivots as they went. But they were like, it was like a ship in the water. They were dropping anchors as they went because there were contracts tying them to the old thing that they had sold. And so all of the engineers they had started getting chopped away because they had to go support the old stuff. All right, so that's the second lesson. Third lesson, everybody, I have to imagine a strategic investor sounds like a really good idea, right? This is a company who's, you have a symbiotic relationship with. Maybe they're going to help sell your product. They're going to also invest in you. That all sounds pretty attractive, right? Anybody here have what you call a strategic investor? Do you? Okay, they're amazing, but they're a double-edged sword, right? Because the one side is really all goodness. The bad side is, as with us, Citrix, big technology company, they just turned on a dime and went, we're going this way now, good luck, and walked away. So we had basically no ability to sell. So between those 3 things, I think there's interesting lessons in there. Not the most wonderful experience. And I warned you ahead of time. I had a whole bunch of failure that I was going to talk about, right? All right. So I have some thoughts about how to turn this into your advantage. All right, so that wasn't enough. That didn't work. Cumologic shut down about 2 months after I left in late 2015. All right, so that brings me to today. What do I want to say about this? All right. Large companies, they are really, really trying to change. So financial services is an interesting industry. I see it across all kinds of industries. Automotive, insurance, financial services like banks, retail, heavy industry. I've got lots of good examples in each one of those, but I'll use financial services, banks in particular, as an example. So large banks right now are scared to death. They're having an existential crisis. They fundamentally are. Here's why. There are just under 3,000 software-centric startups in the US alone that are trying to take pieces of their market. Now, most of the startups are not going to succeed, but that is an awful lot of possible ways that they could see somebody chop off a consumer or chop off a whole block of other consumers, right? So they're fundamentally scared. Now, here's what large companies are trying to do. What they're trying to do right now is they're trying to shift the way that they operate to become much more like a startup, to become a learning organization, to become a company that's able to actually innovate again. And it's exceptionally hard for them, right? And there's really 4 big challenges that I see for that. One is inertia. So if you're a really big company, billions of dollars in revenue, do you want to do something that might put any of that at risk? Well, probably not, right? That's something you want to protect your revenue. The second big thing, and I'm going to use a specific example here. The second big thing is assuming that as a large company, you can go make one big strategic directional shift, and that is going to fundamentally change your business, and you're going to go win again. Okay, how's GE doing? So GE, if some of you remember, not that many years ago, they started advertising with the kind of the stereotypical geek, right, on commercials. And he's like, I went to go work in GE, and you know, my dad gave me a hammer, but I tried to explain I'm a software engineer now. So GE tried this massive push to become a digital organization. And you know, there's a lot of value in that, except they sort of went all in on one big strategy. In addition, they didn't fix a lot of their, you know, the back end of their company. Lots of parts of their businesses were challenges. But GE is a great example of a single initiative attempt at kind of changing your company, and they're really, really struggling because of that. A lot of other examples around that. The third example of a big company trap. So I work in the technology industry. I don't have any software to sell because we're sort of this industry association, but one of the most dangerous things for large companies that are not technology to deal with today is that a sales guy walks in that they trust, and he gives them a piece of paper that says, you can buy your digital transformation. It's just going to cost $100,000 a year, and then you just buy this product, right? So if you see somebody that's just buying a product and attempting to change their whole company, that makes no sense when you say it out loud, but like, it's happening constantly in these large enterprises. They're just like, I just think I can just write a check and I can go buy this thing. And all of a sudden, I'm going to be transformed. Fourth one is the fear of failure. So the cool thing for startups is that, well, you know, it's really scary. And I truly, again, I have not started my own company, but I really empathize with the idea of like the fear of failure as an individual and how you have to be very strong to overcome it and just go after it. And I thought you were really inspirational when you're like, just go after it, right? Like just dive in, call people, try it. But that fear of failure that I think everybody as an individual has inside of you somewhere that you're trying to make quiet, it's like screaming at you when you're in a large company because your performance reviews are based on it. The companies organize themselves around this idea that you can't fail. And so that's really core to the way these big companies work. So those are the challenges that they have. Any of those resonate with you folks? Yeah? If you've worked in a big company? Yeah. They're pretty horrible. But I mean, that's the weaknesses that they have, right? So, you know, if you're a startup, it's okay if you fail. The idea of startups being successful to me is that that's how the market actually creates innovation, right? We have thousands of attempts, and you want to be the one that can actually break through the pack and be successful. So given that there are all of these weaknesses in the large companies, here's some advice that I was coming up with. And I advise a couple of startups that are in the enterprise technology space, and they tend to appreciate this because it sort of relates to how they think about attacking their competition, these larger companies. So the first one is that anybody here read Lean Startup, right? Eric Rice. It's kind of the quintessential how do you iterate book. It is a very wonderful book. Eric's a really smart guy. It's all about this idea that you have to do really, really small incremental experiments. Now, large companies do not get this. I'm telling you right now. They do not understand the idea that you can spend $60 to do a Google survey and get some decent beginning data versus I have to spend $500,000 on some robust survey from a third-party vendor that's going to go, get a bunch of margin on it. You can be really thoughtful about small iteration, incremental, low-cost expenses, right? So focus on that. Second thing is pivot with purpose, right? So if you find yourself, you think you have a product market fit, maybe you need to turn to the left a little bit, right? Don't leave those boat anchors. Because there's another thing. Large companies, they're leaving those boat anchors everywhere, right? And startups, you have an opportunity to avoid it. So think about your pivots very carefully. Think about the commitments that you make very carefully. Don't lock yourselves into a bunch of legacy that as you're trying to really figure out what's going to work for the market, you don't want to be tied to it. Now, maybe that recommendation isn't for the consumer side of things, but for kind of business to businesses. The third was the point that I was making about strategic investors. And I think they're incredibly important. I think that they can open up access to markets. I think that they can open up access to in other investors. I think they're a wonderful thing, except if they're a large company who's trying to find themselves and they change strategies on you, right? So protect against that. Fourth, fundamentally, don't be afraid of large companies. They're wandering around in the dark with a blindfold on, smashing into the walls. Some of them are figuring it out very slowly. I'm trying to help them a little bit. But if you're in competition with a large company or multiple large companies, do not fear them. Think about all those weaknesses that exist and just pick apart at those weaknesses, right? Build your business based on that. So I mentioned SunGard. I was going to kind of update you on that. Well, a couple weeks ago, they finally went bankrupt. It's been a long time coming. Chapter 11 restructuring. Those private equity folks just kind of dropped the mic and left and said good luck. So turns out that was a little bit over 20 years, right? So they lasted a little bit longer than the Fortune 500s are today on average. They call that a success. And again, they invented an industry. And in less than 30 years, they went from building a massive business to being sucked dry and shutting down. So there is a ton of opportunity in all of that change in our market. So I recommend that you all find ways to take advantage of it. So that was a little bit of a history lesson. Seemed like it rambled a little bit, I guess. But any questions?